Welcome. In this session in linear data analysis, we'll explore one of the best-known datasets in machine learning. This is referred to as Fisher's iris dataset. It comes from a 1935 and 1936 field assay conducted on the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec, Canada. And it was studied by Ronald Fisher, and so it's known as Fisher's iris data. So the iris is a flower, and these were multivariate measurements of flowers. There were 3 species of this flowering plant that were collected, and 150 samples in total. It was a balanced sample in that there were 50 of each species present in the data set. And there were 4 measurements taken. 2 of the petals, which are the most prominent part of the flower, and 2 of the sepals, which cover the flower as it evolves. And what we'll want to do is ask, can we discriminate one type, which we'll call type B, this is the beachhead iris, from the other 2, and I'll simply refer to these as a purple plant. So when we go to do k-means clustering on it, it turns out MATLAB provides us this data set in a really simple manner. What we can do is we load Fisher iris, and this will give us a data matrix in our expected form. There will be 150 rows. Each row is an observation of the 4 variables. The first column is the petal length, then the petal width, and then the sepal length and the sepal width. And we'll explore the sepals. So to find this, we can simply take MEAS is the matrix that it has, and we'll take all of the rows, and we'll look only at columns 3 and 4, and we'll pull that into our design matrix. And what we want to do is find the index array and the row-oriented centroids, which in our simple one will be the means, and we'll look for 2 clusters. So to do this in MATLAB is straightforward. What we'll do is we'll find the indexes, so this will return us a 150 by 1 array, and each of these will be a number 1 or number 2 for index 1 or index 2, and it will also return us the row-oriented means. And the function that does this, we simply call k-means with our design matrix, and k in this case is 2. Then we'll plot the results. So this is what the data look like. Here I have the sepal length in centimeters, and I have the sepal width also in centimeters. And here we see there's one cluster visually striking over here, and then the other 2 species are mixed in this group. So the question is, can a k-means algorithm find the clusters? And the answer is, when I run MATLAB, and I run it repeatedly because it's got this random initialization of the centroids, and when I run it, I typically get this kind of result. So it's done a largely good job. However, the combination of the colors that I use and the symbols that I use indicate that there's one oddity in this clustering. Here, by the way, this capital X is the centroid that MATLAB computed for this cluster, and this capital X is the centroid that it computed for this cluster. So what's going on with this? Visually, it looks as though that vector ought to be in this subset, and instead it's put in this subset. Well, what is happening is this is part of how k-means works, is this will be grouped in with this subset based on the distance between this data vector and the centroid of this cluster versus this data vector and the centroid of this cluster. This data vector happens to be ever so slightly closer to this centroid than it is to this centroid, and so MATLAB will put it in this subset. Now, what can we do about this? Well, one thing we can do is we can ask, is there a separating hyperplane? And the answer is that for every pair of centroids, we can find a separating hyperplane. And so what we'll do in subsequent sessions is we'll explore the relationship between these centroids that are computed by a k-means algorithm, such as the one implemented in MATLAB, and a separating hyperplane, which we've already explored briefly as being a fundamental technology for machine learning. So, what have we learned in this lecture? Well, We should now be able to compute the distance from a point to one of these hyperplanes, whether this hyperplane is represented using a unit normal or a general normal vector. We can describe two different definitions of clusters as being sets or being centroids. And we should be able to implement the basic k-means iteration from the understanding that we've got in this lecture. And we can also, of course, use MATLAB to perform our clustering.